Hi, I'm iKia, and for today's video, I want to give an in-depth guide into the weapon damage calculation of Division 2. And to coincide with this video as well, I have written up a guide, which will be linked down below, of course. The guide is meant as a standalone piece on its own, and will be basically going through this guide in this video. But especially in video form, I feel I can add in quite a few things, as especially we'll be even doing the calculation on a simple calculator, just to show how it even can be done without spreadsheets and such. And the weapon damage calculation is very useful to know for even casual players, as having a grasp of it will make a lot of choices that people make, more advanced players that make builds. It will make the choices make sense, and will make it obvious why those kind of choices get made. And especially for this video, for the first part of it, as with all my in-depth guides in the first chapter, we'll go over what I would consider the basics of it. We'll go over how the calculation is done, where all of the stats come from, how it's calculated and such. And then we'll end it off by doing the calculation once for a build. And in a second part, which is what I feel I can add kind of to the conversation, as many videos already exist for the damage calculations, which are, most of them are also very good. Some of them are also very bad. Many Reddit posts and stuff, of course, exist about it as well. And it isn't a hard set to understand. But especially in the second part, in the second chapter, we'll go over some of the quirks, which is what I feel I can add into the conversation, as I'll especially try to explain how I would explain some of the quirks of the system. And these systems, because it is not only the Division 2 that kind of uses these systems, this type of calculation, are quite common. And yeah, there's always been ways of trying to explain why, for instance, something that is additive to itself is different than a separate multiplier. And I will attempt to explain them to the best of my abilities. And I feel I've done a decentish job. We'll see how it ends up. But yeah, we'll be, especially in the second chapter, going over a lot of the quirks. So yeah, let's jump into the main calculation. And we will start with how the calculation is usually presented in Word form, as that is quite easy to understand. And this is actually the basics of it, although you will need some knowledge to go from this main explanation, which is usually quite often given through many places, to go from this to an actual calculation. Because, of course, these are words, they represent numbers, but how they actually become a calculation is oftentimes left out. But yeah, to go over first the main explanation in Word form, it is a base number. This is the base weapon damage of any weapon. Every weapon in the game has a base damage associated with it. It is different per weapon type. So, for instance, all FAMASs have the same weapon damage. All vectors have the same, the 45 vectors, for instance, all share a weapon damage. But for instance, the 9mm vector and the TAC vector have different base damages than the 45 vector. We'll go into where to derive this from, either by back calculating or sources online. We'll discuss that in a little bit in a further part. Then we will always, in each step, multiply by. So each step is multiplied by the steps in between, except for two parts where we have sets. The sets are, of course, for instance, of course, all of these stats are additive sources to themselves. And that means that there are only two places where there are two sets of different numbers that isn't instantly clear, that are still additive to each other. That is in the case of all weapon damage and specific weapon damage. And is also the case for crit damage and headshot. So for only those two steps do we need to actually keep them together, because for the other parts, it is all multiplication. That also means that there is no set order to this, because every step that is not in brackets, basically, the brackets part, they need to stay together. They cannot be separated. But every other step we could do in any order that we would want, because it's all multiplication. As long as you're doing the same type of arithmetic through an entire calculation part, you can just change the order of things, because 3 times 2 times 1 is the same as 1 times 2 times 3. This is just something of mathematics that, yeah, I would hope most people would know, but sometimes it's easy to miss for others. We'll continue on with discussing total weapon damage. This is, of course, a sum as well of all the total weapon damage on the build, multiplied by crit damage plus headshot. And of course, these are conditional, and you may not want to have the crit damage one. You might want to have the non-crit damage shot. And you basically put in or leave out as you wish for the calculation. And to do the calculation, really, you need to do, if you want to have it for all forms, you basically need to do all variations of this, which is 4 of them. And then, of course, another with either DTA or DTH, on or off. And then also for DTOC, on or off. But what we usually do is do one calculation, basically, and we'll put in and leave out numbers as we want, as what the situation in front of us seems to imply. And at the end here, although, of course, there's no order, but here at the end of this, at the explanation part of the end of it, we're discussing other multipliers and amps. And this could be many amps, and they're all multiplicative to everything else. So you just stack them on somewhere, in this case, for me, at the end. And amps are, of course, things that are self-multiplicative, either for the 2 things that are still exist in the game that are, or are single source and are, by that definition, amps, and are multiplicative to everything always. Think, for instance, glass or opportunistic or things like that. But then, in order to make it an actual calculation, as I explained in this paragraph over here, what we need to do is actually add in a representation into each step of the percentage base. Because when you're increasing something by, if you're doubling something, you are increasing it by 100%, but calculation-wise, you're doing, it is 200% of the number that you had before. This is just something that some people miss a little bit, and yeah, takes us. You just need to understand that, basically. As to take it into calculation form, we need to put a representation of the base into each step before it multiplies against the next thing, basically. And we are doing that here, meaning that if we're going with a percentage-based calculation, so we're taking just the numbers in percentage form as they are in the stat screen, then it basically is like this, is base times 100% plus, for instance, in this case, all weapon damage plus specific damage percentages, just all additive together in this part and then multiplying against the next part. And this, of course, percentages are to alter them into multipliers, which we actually need, because while you can calculate it in percentages, it is much easier to calculate it in multiplier form. To alter it into multiplier form, because I feel as well that this is something that a lot of people seem to sometimes have issue with, or, well, mistakenly don't do, is that what you basically do is the representation of 100% as a single, as a multiplier within a calculation is 1. So 100% is times 1. The stats then need to be divided by 100 to also go from percentage form into a multiplier form. That means, for instance, yeah, that's 180 crit damage, let's say, for a build. That would become a 1.8 as we're dividing it basically by 100. Just the dot moves up to, and there, in this way, we can much more easily calculate it all together. So when we actually calculate it, this is usually the form that we do it in, which is that it's the base as a full number, because that is just a derived number, and then it multiplies against everything else. And in those steps, we need to add a representation of the base into it. So yeah, let's move it on to defining all of these stats and amps. And let's indeed define each of these stats. And as I say here at the top as well, it is important to keep in mind that some talents, and especially the ones that show up on your buff bar and such, do not show up on your stat screen. So you do still need to account for all of them to match the in-game numbers. Because if you leave any number out and you do the calculation, and what we quite often use the calculation for is to match to in-game numbers, you will not match in-game numbers, of course, because if anything is left out, the calculation in-game is doing one thing, your calculation is doing something else. And it is important to account for all things. Now we'll go through some of the things that are here. I will do it a little more briefly than I've written it all out here, because the written guide is available. If you are struggling with any part, you can go and read it. But as we discussed, base is the base damage of weapons of the build. It is a fixed value per weapon type. So each weapon type has its own stat. It is viewable in truncated form, as I'll show in a little bit, as we'll go into another graphic. We'll discuss it there. And back calculatable from a weapon damage derived by, from the stat screen, we can take the weapon damage there. We can derive it with this calculation, which is basically back calculating from the weapon damage back to what the status weapon damage is, the stated that weapon damage is. But that contains basically all weapon damage and specific weapon damage, and we're back calculating to what the base would be of that weapon. To also say it is also, of course, retrievable from spreadsheets like the Discord and Reddit ones. So, for instance, with my burst and sustain tables, the base numbers are there. You can just copy them over from here, or you can back calculate them. Or the Reddit Discord, the Reddit and the Discord spreadsheet both have it as well, and my damage tables as well. And this will be, of course, as well linked down below. If we jump back. All weapon damage is the all weapon damage stats viewable from stat screen. Specific weapon damage. This is a term that I specifically use, and some others as well. It is the weapon damages, for instance, assault rifle damage, marksman rifle damage. I feel once you see specific weapon damage, most people will understand what is meant by that. But of course, because that is in-game a different number, for instance, Fenris gives only assault weapon damage, but not all weapon damage. It is important to account for it and also account it in a way that is applying to your current health weapon. So you can take, for instance, SMG weapon damage and add it into your calculation if you're firing an AR and trying to match in-game. And yeah, indeed, as it says here as well, specific weapon damage and all weapon damage together form one number and then multiply against the rest, as we showed with the calculation as well. Total weapon damage, TWD is total weapon damage. This is separate from weapon damage or specific weapon damage. This will be derived mostly from talents. You have to basically read through your talents. It will state total before weapon damage, in most cases, when it is total weapon damage. Although we have a lot of errors currently within the game with how stuff is named, you can, especially from the Discord spreadsheet, go into there. It's currently for most of the talents and from gear and weapons, it will show what the calculation for, or what it actually is as a stat, or what its calculation form is, meaning that you can derive from there if it's weapon damage, total weapon damage, or an amp or such, because there are a lot of things within the game that are misnamed currently. And yeah, critical hit damage is CHD. This was just retrievable from the stat screen, although it can come from talents as well, of course. Headshot, HSD is a headshot damage. It is what we apply as when we do headshots. This is also viewable from the stat screen, and of course can come from many of the talents. And it is important to know that critical hit damage and headshot damage are additive to each other before they multiply against everything else. This is a quirk added in, especially specifically for Division. This is actually not something that many games will do. The reason for this is to make it so that stacking crit damage and headshot damage is not as viable as it would be without it. It's basically making it that you have to choose between one or the other for most cases, because you will be getting less and less return per points as you're adding them together. And also, we have weapons that, for instance, if this was the case, if they were multiplicative to each other and multiplicative to everything else, then, for instance, something like the agonizing bite from Diamondback would be the most meta thing within this game. So they just added in this quirk to get rid of something like that. Damage to armor, DTA. This is specifically armor that is the white bars above on veterans, on elites, and such. There is, of course, as well, armor plates, which is on warhounds and on heavies. That isn't the same. So armor plates is actually DTH, damage to health, that applies to it. DTA basically requires the enemy to have white bars on their health bars. That is the actual armor. Armor plates are health. A little bit of a quirk, but yeah, it is what it is, and it is just something that you need to know. Damage to health is the inverse of damage to armor. Within this game, everything is either armor or health. Health is basically the continuous bar that exists, and for instance, reds only have that. Same for heavies, of course, and warhounds and stuff like that. Only one of these two will be active at a time. At the point where you cross over, the amount of damage that you do to the armor will be calculated as DTA, and the amount of DTH as DTH of that one shot. So it can be, to try to simulate the game back, it can be quite annoying, because you will need to know where the crossover point is. What we usually do for calculation-wise, we'll pick one and then calculate with that, and or spit out two numbers, one for DTH, one for DTA, because, for instance, of course, ARs will have a massive amount of DTH available to them and not DTA. And you can do that and then just from that make an educated guess of how often each of the two will be active, and from that make conclusions. Damage to targets out of cover. Either set as DTOOC, or usually what I say it as well, DTOC, although I usually write it out as DTOOC, is damage to targets out of cover. It is the target that needs to be out of cover, the enemy. It is based on basically their animations. This has a very high availability and activeness, and because of that, it is one of the strong choices that we make. Important to note is that what I consider to be stats is basically, we have base is its own thing, is base. Everything from all weapon damage all the way down to this DTOC, I just consider all of them to be stats. And that is because they all work in the same way, which is that they are additive to themselves and multiplicative to each other. Of course, the only two exceptions are that specific weapon damage and all weapon damage and crit damage and headshot that are sets together. But those are just quirks, basically, at that point. One important thing to note is that while DTH and DTA are on the stat screen, damage to targets out of cover isn't. So you just need to derive it from, well, there are in effect really only two sources, which is Fox's Prayer and your third or second stat on your weapon. And you just have to derive it from that. Then we have other multipliers, in this case as amps, each of them as a separate instance. So you could have dozens of these in a row. You should act on them as separate multipliers, so you don't add all of these together as multipliers all together and then multiply against them. They're just each a separate instance of an amp. And these will have to be derived from your talents, and if you are also, for instance, accounting for group buffs and such, you will have to account for them in this way as well, as a lot of the buffs coming from other players are usually total weapon damage in the case of FI especially, or amps in the case of opportunistic or other forms of buffs. And yeah, each amp will act as its own multiplier and will never be additive in its own in any form. This is an important part of amps. Amps are basically the multiplicatives of this game. And especially when we are talking about additive and multiplicative, we are especially talking about additive to itself or multiplicative to itself, which we will discuss in the quirk section. So, and I feel that is something that many people do wrong. So that is an important part, I feel, if you think that, especially if you have in your head currently that Fox's prayer is multiplicative, I implore you to go and watch especially the additive versus multiplicative section of this video, because that is not the case. And yeah, let's move on to showing where these stats come from, and to show where in-game these stats will be come from, where the numbers representing those stats will come from. I've made this graphic. We'll go through it briefly, and I'll also jump into game and actually show it in-game as well, as I have that opportunity, of course, well, in a video form. If we go through it, we have a base, which is, as we described earlier, the base weapon damage. It is derived from either a back calculation or just taking a number. The weapon damage, or all weapon damage, as the name calls it, or as the game calls it, but I usually shorten it to weapon damage just for easiness. Specific weapon damage, both are shown here. Let's actually show all three together, because those three are linked together. We'll jump into game as I struggle there to hit my shortcut. We here at the top of our stats, we have weapon damage. If we move on a little bit, scroll a little bit further, these are the all weapon damage bonuses at the top, and then the specific weapon damages. Only one, of course, will be active at a time. So for instance, here I'm using an AR, so only this AR bonus will be active. So we add these two together. That's a weapon damage, all weapon damage. If we jump back to the guide and go over the next view, critical hit chance is actually not required to do a single hit weapon calculation, but it is required to move it on into further things like calculating out an average damage per shot, and from there going into DPS or into damage per mag, and further calculations like that. For a single hit, you leave out crit chance, because it is either you are calculating either a crit damage shot or a non-crit damage shot. You basically, if you want to have the crit damage number, you'll add in this number, and then you'll also do a separate calculation without it. Headshot, of course, is headshot damage, and both of these are basically conditionals. So crit damage and headshot are conditionals. Crit damage is, of course, conditional to if you're critting with crit chance. Headshot is, of course, conditional to if you're hitting the head. To show these as well, again, in-game, we're jumping on over, and they are underneath the weapon damage as a crit chance, crit damage, and headshot, and it is literally just these numbers. Now, of course, for calculation form, we are deriving these into a multiplier number instead of a percentage number. So they are divided by 100 and plus 1. So for instance, as a multiplier, this 90 headshot becomes, instead of 90 headshot, it becomes first 9 by dividing by 100, and then, 0.9 by dividing by 100, and then 1 plus 0.9 is 1.9 as a multiplier. If we jump back again into the guide, we have next up total weapon damage. Total weapon damage is a little bit more annoying. It is derived from talents, mostly, yes, only from talents. There is one weapon talent that holds it. The rest is all gear talents. Some are from group buffs as well, on Overwatch and FI. So you sometimes need to account for this, and the way to do that is, for instance, in this case, you need to kind of know. That is a little bit more annoying part, although you can just go through your talents and check what they are. So for instance here, vigilance, as it says here, increases total weapon damage, and that is how it usually is worded, although we have a lot of misworded talents nowadays. So you're somewhat better off double checking as well with others in the community. Either, for instance, asking around on the official Discord is a good place in the Ask Community channel. And a lot of people find this a little bit weird, this total weapon damage, as weapon damage is in orange, and then it usually states it as increases total weapon damage. This is wording that kind of comes from like card games and such. For instance, in Magic the Gathering, something like this would be worded like this. And what this implies is that instead of adding into an existing pool of weapon damage, it takes the total pool of weapon damage and increases it by this amount. in wording it this way, it implies that it's a separate multiplier. And while it is annoying for us because we're dealing now with weapon damage, total weapon damage, and specific weapon damage in the case how I word it, or like assault rifle weapon damage and stuff like that. Yeah, we have a lot of things that say damage. But yeah, it is just something you will have to learn. Some talents are total weapon damage, some are amps, some are something else. Yeah, you have to kind of just understand that over time. But it isn't too hard, and there are sources available to understand them. If we move back into the guide, we then have the other conditionals, which are DTA/DTH, so damage to armor or damage to health, and damage to targets out of cover. These are, of course, again, conditionals. Armor needs armor, health needs health, damage to targets out of cover needs the enemy to be out of cover. Damage to health and damage to armor in game show up as in the stat screen. They are separate stats out here in armor damage and health damage. They get just calculated up neatly here and shown. Damage to targets out of cover doesn't. This is just a weird quirk for those interested into why that is, as they repurpose two stats. One of these used to be damage to elites. One of them used to be something else. I don't exactly remember. But yeah, they repurposed two of them into armor damage and health damage, and they did not make a new stat point for damage to targets out of cover. But damage to targets out of cover really only has two sources in the Fox's Prayer and weapons. So it is quite easy to find out how much you have. So just, yeah, if you have a Fox, that's 8%. If you have a weapon, that's either 10 or 12%, 10% for most weapon types, and then LMGs have 12%, if at full, of course. You do need to, of course, as well, this is a good point of maybe saying it, if your stats aren't at full, of course, that will show up in the stat screen here. But yeah, you need to actually account for your stats as they are if you want to have a matching number with in-game. I would hope that would be obvious, but I'll just also flat out say it just in case. As we then end that graphic with other multipliers, amps. It shows a few there, for instance, as well. If we jump back into game, these come from talents. Something like glass states it as all damage you deal is amplified by 30%. Something like opportunistic says something similar from all sources, as it states there. And yeah, these are amps, and amps are basically separate multiplier always. So total weapon damage is a pool. So if you had, for instance, obliterate, which is total weapon damage as well, as we have, for instance, here, as it says here, increases total weapon damage by 25% when full. The total weapon damages get added together additively from all sources before multiplying against the rest. So that means that total weapon damage is a pool. All of the amps are separate multipliers always. There is, of course, as well, some that are a little bit more weird. And for instance, in the case of Intimidate, misworded as weapon damage, as it says here for Intimidate. Intimidate is actually 7 stacks of a 5% amp at full strength. And yeah, because of those kind of things, you kind of sometimes need to just ask around on the community, on community discourse if you're doing the calculation right. And usually if you basically don't match up and you don't know where it's coming from and you're not sure about a talent, that's the point to go and ask around or look around, especially, for instance, in the Discord spreadsheet. Nowadays, it has done a good job of collating all of this data out. As yeah, we'll move it now on into explaining into how it calculates just briefly. And in this how it calculates section, we're basically putting into word form what the calculation is doing. To do that, it is quite actually simple. And this is the case for actually a lot of these calculation types. It is in 2 parts. All things are done in 2 parts. And that is if it's additive or multiplicative to itself, and then additive or multiplicative to others. In our case, we do not have actually many that are additive to themselves and additive to others, except for in the cases of all weapon damage and specific weapon damage and crit damage and headshot. Those are additive to themselves and then additive to one other and then multiplicative to the rest. So those two have quirks in that way. But usually as well, this is the reason why we don't really use the term additive or multiplicative. You will quite often not find me using those just on their own. because it is important to state if it's what it is and if it's additive or multiplicative to itself or others, that to itself or others, or from all sources, and to all other sources. That's a very important part. As well, if we go through the list just briefly, as indeed, all weapon damage is together additive from all sources and multiplies against the rest. Total weapon damage is additive from all sources and multiplies against the rest. Crit damage and headshot together are additive from all sources and multiplies against the rest. DTA and DTH is additive from all sources and multiplies against the rest. So for instance, there, quite often people will say DTA, and the following one as well, DTOC, that they're multiplicative. They are not. They are additive from all sources and multiplicative to all the rest. They work in the very same way as the other stats, and we'll go into the quirks and explain why they are actually better than some of the other stats, but it is not because they're multiplicative. Because as well, in many of the games that we use, as for instance as well, just to say the last ones here, DTOC, as it states there, is additive from all sources and multiplicative to all the rest. It is doing the same thing as, for instance, total weapon damage is doing, or all weapon damage is doing. These stats, as they are additive to themselves, basically, and multiplicative to others, except for headshot and crit damage. Because, for instance, as well, you can just consider together all weapon damage and specific weapon damage as one pool and call it weapon damage, which is what I usually do. We just consider those stats to be one. You just need to know that, though, because that is important, because they're two separate numbers. You are adding them together. But DTOC here is not acting in any real different way in calculation form. It is additive from all sources. You usually, if you have a Fox's Prayer in your build, it is additive from that and your weapon together. And that, of course, is one of my biggest gripes with a lot of people in the community, where they call the Fox's Prayer, why is it better? It's because it's multiplicative, except that it isn't. We'll do a follow-up video, and especially on quirks like that and things that the community quite often gets wrong, I feel. But yeah, it is important to state if it's from the additive and the multiplicative on their own, don't mean much. Unless you're also specifying if it's to itself or to others. That is a very important part, and a really easy way for me, at least, to see if somebody isn't familiar with damage calculations within games. Because as well, what usually is implied, because a lot of other games use the same system of things being additive to themselves and multiplicative to the rest, or multiplicative to themselves and multiplicative to the rest. Because as well, if you're multiplicative to yourself, you're already multiplicative to the rest as well. Because if you're in your own step are multiplicative, then you're just multiplicative. And that is what we usually call multiplicative. So in the case of division, all the amps act as multiplicatives. But for most of them, they are also single source. So we don't have two sources for glass, and in that way it is multiplicative. If we had two of glass, then they would be multiplicative to themselves as well. So that is quite a common misnomer. So I wanted to have my tirade there, because I feel it is important. And to end it up there as how it calculates as that is amps multiply against all other stats and amps. And that is, in word form, basically what we have shown at the start, what the calculation was. Let's move on to why it's useful to actually understand this. And to lead into the end of this first part, we will discuss why this is useful, as I feel a lot of people as well struggle with understanding that part. And that is, as well, in all systems, when you understand it, or when you can put it into a calculation form, for instance, as we have here, it comes with two useful things that it provides you. One is prediction, and the other is verification. So with prediction, it means that we can alter parts of it, as I explained here in text form as well, is that prediction is what we do when we calculate out a build by putting in the stats into a damage calculator, or just calculating it out, or doing it in your own spreadsheet, and get average damages, for instance, to calculate towards that, and by extension going into DPS and damage per mag of a build. Also, by having the stats available to be altered, you can alter parts of the build in a spreadsheet form instead of actually doing it within game and testing it out with the numbers. You can predict what the outcome will be. And this is, for instance, what we use to, for instance, say why you should go a choice over another. Why you should pick Cheska over Grupo for strikers, for instance. Stuff like that is easier to calculate out once you understand the system like this than trying to do within game, because within game you would need matching pieces and stuff to get actual numbers out. And of course, the other, as I state here, is verifying. And verifying is that you can go backwards, basically, with the calculation. You can see if the calculation is matching in game. Once you have a calculation that you trust and you understand that it is correct, you can go, wait, is this stat, as for instance we have quite recently with X0 coming into the game, where the backpack talent states weapon damage, but it ends up being an amp to weapons and ballistic skills. The only way to derive such a thing or understand such a thing is to verify it by back calculating. So we do a calculation, we see if it matches in game. We will then trust the calculation more than the game, and then we will try to derive where that stat actually is by putting it into different pools or setting it just as its own separate multiplier. And in doing so, we can get numbers out of a calculation, and then we can see which one matches the game. And in doing so, then, for instance, in the case of X0, we saw that it was a separate multiplier not going into any of the pools. Then we can say it is an amp. And both of those are, of course, very strong things to do, especially prediction is quite useful for a lot of people, as we can theory craft without actually doing the crafting. Because going out and farming everything and trying to get the numbers out is a lot harder than just spreadsheeting it out. For the last part of this first part, as I'm splitting this video into two parts, as I did intend to make it one somewhat long video, but it's moving towards a very long video. We'll come back to the quirks as they are here, although you can go and read the written guide as is and go through it already, because I'll be releasing the guide as is. We'll be coming back to the quirks in a second part, as that will be a separate video, just to keep it somewhat manageable and somewhat viewable. But what we will still do in this video is to actually take the build as we had it in game there, and take this build and actually do a damage calculation just to show actually how it works. And to round off part one of this now two-part video, I do want to do a calculation just to show it, as I find that most people that struggle with this, usually more in my personal sphere, as when I'm helping people understand it through Discord or just helping them out, doing the calculation with someone usually solves a lot of issues or problems that they might have had. As well, we'll likely run into one of the common things that people don't understand, which is rounding issues, especially when you start going through many multipliers. As I've picked here a build specifically that likely will provide us with such an issue. Although as well, I've picked an easy build to calculate, as we have no stacking talent, so we don't have to stack first to get a number out. I've picked up a talent that isn't a damage talent, for instance, as well on the weapon. For instance, also no striker with its stacking talents and stuff like that, because especially when you have stacking talents, you usually kind of need to do a full number and an empty number for it to be useful and stuff like that. Here we will be hitting the same number over and over again because nothing is stacking or increasing or decreasing, making it a little bit easier for us in these purposes. Yeah, the build has been picked because it has a bunch of multipliers, so we will likely maybe even get a rounding error. I haven't tried it out yet, but we'll likely see. And we're gonna do what is with the guide basically provided, the final actual calculation as multipliers, as is selected there, as is grade in there. That is the part we're going to do, and we're going to do it in a different order than is stated there, because as I said, of course, there is no order to this. The game likely does use a specific order, and it will be handy maybe if we ever figured it out exactly, because it would allow us to do the rounding in the same way, as we'll likely run into. But what I'm going to do first is take the numbers and take them into the calculator there. And we're going to go up to what we would call white damage, or that which is body shot non-crit. So we're going to first calculate our way from base to all the way to body shot non-crit, because then, of course, we can either add in from that point either headshot or crit or both, and go from there. Which is usually, while I don't often anymore calculate it outside of spreadsheets, with just a calculator, you can still do this, of course. But yeah, what we'll add in first, as we went through the calculation earlier, I will as well start with the base. That one is kind of required quite often to be easy, then you can see the numbers rise in a pretty consistent way, and gives the least amount of rounding errors. So we have a FAMAS in our hand, a grade 24 one, because, of course, I had one. I had to show it off, of course. It is also, especially just for everyone out there, it is not worth it to grade to 24 unless you PvP, maybe, or if you are very attached to a weapon, which is my case, as I love my waffle FAMAS, as this weapon has been around with me for quite a while, and it is came god rolled with a free talent. How could I not love this thing, right? So it does get special treatment and goes to grade 24, where I don't really do that for any other weapon. And we are taking that base, which is 44191, which I just know. Although, of course, as I said, you can back calculate it from this weapon damage, or actually just take this weapon damage, as I'll discuss in a second, and or from spreadsheets, or just do it in several different ways. Because as well, I'm going to multiply this now by what I would consider usually the first step for me is to add in all weapon damage bonus together with the specific weapon damage bonus. So these two together are, of course, 154%. So they just get added together, 124 plus 130. We are increasing a number basically by 154%. That means that the total at the end of the result must be 254% of the original, because the 100% goes in there representing the base. That is what that 1 plus does in that calculation. It is a representation of the base required to increase a number instead of, for instance, if you only had 30%, or if you were increasing it, like we will with vigilance in a second, with 25%, if we were to times 0.25 as a multiplier, we are, of course, instead of increasing that number, we are turning it into 1/4 of the number. So there's always that 1 plus, and then the multiplier as is derived from here. So the multiplier as is derived from here is 1.54. 1 plus as a representation for base, so we are 2.54. So I'm going to times this by 2.54. And we get this number out of it, or 112, 245.14. A little bit of a rounding discrepancy there, of course, but that is quite common, and that will, as well as we lead into further points of this, will lead into likely some issues, as is quite often the case. But also, if we scroll up, you may notice that this weapon, that number that we have there, is the same kind of as we have here, because this is what this number is. This is where this number comes from. This is weapon damage times the multiplier that you are derived from all weapon damage plus specific weapon damage. So you could actually skip the step that I just did and just take this weapon damage bonus, because it's the same number. It's done the step for us if we wanted to. But I'm going off of that one just to get a little bit more chances of rounding errors, as I want to show that. As I feel that is something that a lot of people don't understand, as we usually round different than the game. In this case, I'll go first with DTOC, and then DTH, which will come from the weapon. We're leaving out DTA from the contractors. It's not going to be active. We're going to be shooting at a red target at the range, which will only have health, just for simplicity's sake. And we're going to just derive this damage to targets out of cover from the weapon, and the Fox's Prayer. And those, of course, do not show up on the start screen. We just have to go and figure out on the build where they are. In this case, of course, we know that. So it's an 18% increase. They're 10% plus 8%. Together, they form a 1.18 multiplier. So times 1.18, we get a new number out. Let's follow that up by taking health times 1.21. So 21% again becomes a 0.21% multiplier derived from this. And of course, to multiply against the base is 1.21%, 1.21 multiplier. So in this case again, so times this. Here we get a number that is above a rounding. And we'll keep that in mind here, but we'll move on for now, and we'll likely jump back to this point. As we'll add in now vigilance and glass, as those are the last two things that will go into a body shot non-crit. So we're moving to a body shot non-crit. These are the only multipliers that will be active for that, because crit damage, of course, isn't a non-crit, and we're not shooting at the head, so no headshot. But we'll take this number as is now, and we'll go times 1.25 for vigilance, which is a 25%. And in this case, there are no other sources of total weapon damage, so it's not adding into a pool together or something as it would, for instance, with obliterate. We're just taking this 25%. It's a 1.25% of the total once we're done with it. So we need to multiply by 1.25%, 1.25 as a multiplier. As I'll quite often will stumble with multiplier and percentages as we'll convert them over and over. But as long as you do it right, if you say it's wrong, it's fine, as you'll correct yourself quite often. We have that number, and now we'll have only glass left as we have it here. And glass for 30%, so it's a 1.3 multiplier, although you could, of course, go 1.30 multiplier, but that 0 is redundant. It will not do anything. So you could just, we'll do 1.30, but yeah, you could just do 1.3, of course. So as we needed to do that to this number, I think I can double click this. There we go, times 1.3. We get this number, 260 to 428.3. Now, if we go into the game, I'm at the range. I'm looking at this red bastard, and I'm going to shoot him, and hopefully we'll get a non-crit, as we instantly do, actually. So we have there 260429. If we rounded our number in the calculator, it would be rounded down. So it would be 428, and that's actually works out perfectly for purposes here. As the game seems... Of course, their game, it has its own set order that it will calculate in. Well, there is no order to the calculation. The game likely does, of course, use an order. And it seems to, whenever it can round up, likely in the background, it will be rounding up. So we had a step here, if we go back to our calculator, we had a step here where we could have rounded up, but we didn't. And I find that usually if you actually do round up at the steps in between each step, if you can round it up, or if you can add all your multipliers together, that's also a better way of doing it. But we're here just for easiness and just to have more access to changing stuff. We are doing it separately. So we'll take this this number. I can actually copy it, and we can, I think, as well paste it. So we have this number, but instead of that 3 at the end, we're going to round it up to 4. We were at this step where we had DTH added in, so we only needed to add in vigilance and glass. So this is times 1.25, and then times 1.3. And now we get a very clean, as we have rounded up from that point, we get a very clean matching number from the calculation. And this, I feel, trips up a lot of people because, for instance, as well, my calculators, my simple damage calculators, spit out numbers that are unrounded at steps, meaning that they might be off by up to a few digits even. Usually if it's, by a few integers, if it's more than 1 digit, usually something is wrong, especially if it's more than several digits worth. But if it's just the last digit that is off, that is within rounding error of how the game calculates it. But yeah, now we have a matching number with in-game because we only had 4 multipliers. We rounded once, and that seems to have been as well what the game had been doing there. Now, let's move it up to also do adding in crit damage and headshot. So in this case, we're going to move it on, as we did there, a body shot non-crit. We're going to move it up to head. Let's go all the way and make it a crit damage headshot, because you could either add in crit damage to just get a body shot crit. You could either add in just headshot and get a headshot number, as you would just do the number that we have there times 1.9, a multiplier. That would be headshot. Let's add them together, because these are, of course, additive to each other when we do a crit headshot with it. So we're going to times that number that we just had there, the body shot one. So you could as well skip calculating out the body shot one and just take the one from the range there, as it's a matching number. And then if you just wanted to add in crit, you could just go from there. You could go to headshot or to both, as we have here. And yeah, that is quite handy to know, because yeah, you could skip steps and move from a number derived from the range. Because as well, for instance, even once we get this crit headshot, if we, for instance, were to go like, oh, but what if somebody provided us with opportunistic? Although likely they're providing us with more bonuses than just opportunistic, which is usually a little bit more, you need to account for all of them. But if we wanted to just go just opportunistic, they went out of their way to not have any other bonuses and no grow bonuses. They're running technician, and they're just only Faradaying us and not providing a damage bonus. You could then just take the whole number and multiply it by 1.1 for normal and 1.15 for perfect opportunistic. But here we're going to add in this multiplier, because especially this one is a big one. This is together in percentage, added together, it's 273. It's a total of the number there will be 373. As a multiplier, 373 is 3.73. So we're timesing this by 3.73. We're getting a number out. And likely at this point as well, we'll have another rounding error, because that is quite common in the high numbers that we're getting into. And while this is, of course, not the highest numbers, as we will reach into the millions and stuff, but we're adding in several multipliers together, and we'll be rounding differently than the game does. And if I actually take the shot there and let's put it next to the calculator there, we are off by 2. Basically, we'll be rounding down to 971 400, and the game is showing 971 402. And those rounding errors we just have to live with. Although, of course, that while we don't get exact numbers matching quite often you do as well. With simple calculations, you quite often do as well, because if it's especially not as many multipliers as we're using here, then it can be quite a lot more consistent than here. But especially wanted to show this one, because I was expecting it to have a little bit of rounding issues, because we're adding in pretty big multipliers altogether, and several of them, where, for instance, as well, if you had strikers, you're already taking out the parts of a damage targets out of cover and stuff, and just having its big bonus be one of the big bonuses. Yeah, that actually will lead us into the conclusion of this video. And indeed, we're going to end this video here-ish, as I was hoping actually, to do the entire guide in one video, but going through it, it became quite quickly clear that it would have been way too long. And I would rather than do it as 2 separate videos, as in the next video, we'll continue on with the guide as where we left off, as we went here basically through the factual parts. In a second part, we'll go through what the rest of the guide already does have written out, and for those interested can already go and read it, the quirks of the system, talking about why additive to themselves parts are different from amplifiers and such, and why stats will give worse return per points, and why systems like this get used basically by games such as this. It's a common way of doing video game stats. Although, yeah, that video will follow this up not too long, because the guide is basically ready. I just need to take the time to go through it. But the next video will be the Heartbreaker Tech Tank Showcase, as I very much know that a lot of people are looking forward to a shorter version than the masterclass to show around and enjoy. So I'm going to do that next, and that will follow this one up in a few days. Likely as well, that will be followed up by a video about the new season, but mostly I will set that in what it will change for me in the build collection. The changes I will be basically making to the build collection due to the changes, and what weapons will and won't make it into it. And I'll give a hint already that once I have an Ouroboros, likely it will make it into many a build, as in its current state it is a little bit still overpowered. Yeah, several other changes, of course, with Devil the Spear and Iron Lungs going into some builds. And of course, as well, Xero. So yeah, and likely after that one, we'll revisit the quirks and go through the rest of this guide. So yeah, I hope you all join me for those, or for over on Twitch, where I am streaming most days, almost every day, starting at 9 p.m. Central European Summertime, and the link is down below. And especially as well, if for those a little bit interested in it, even to maybe give me a follow over there, as that is very much appreciated, as I'm just trying to grow a little bit there and make a little bit of a community. And the only thing left now is for me to wish you guys and gals to have a good night.